Hi, welcome to a new episode in the Internet Surfer, hosting the most horror and creepiest stories from Reddit. Please don't forget to comment, like, share, and subscribe. Enjoy.
The Silent Apartment Complex. A long horror story from Reddit NoSleep. I had heard about the place long before I ever set foot there. It was one of those stories that floated around the fringes of journalism, whispered over drinks by veteran reporters who had heard about it but never dared to go. An apartment complex where tenants vanished without a trace, where strange events drove people mad, leaving only hushed rumors in their wake. No one knew how many had disappeared from there, but the number was enough to earn it a reputation that drew me in like a moth to a flame. I was a reporter. And if there was a mystery begging to be unraveled, I was going to be the one to do it. The place was called Silvercrest Apartments. From the outside, it did not look like much, a shabby, aging structure in the outskirts of the city, tucked away from the bustling downtown. The paint on the walls was faded, chipped in places, and the windows were covered in a layer of grime that spoke of years of neglect. The kind of place you would walk by and never give a second thought. Yet, it was this unassuming facade that hid something darker. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sky hanging low with clouds, casting a gray pallor over everything. The wind had picked up, pushing dead leaves and debris along the cracked sidewalk as I stood at the entrance. The caretaker had agreed to meet me, though he did not seem keen on the idea when I called. The first thing I noticed as I approached was the silence. No sounds of tenants coming or going, no signs of life. It was unsettling for a building this size. I felt a chill, though the wind had died down. At the door, a middle-aged man with a hollow face and a lifeless expression stood waiting. His eyes were dull, as though whatever spark of life had once been there had long since faded. He introduced himself simply as Mr. Carrick. He did not extend his hand. "You're the reporter?" he asked, his voice low and monotone. "I am," I replied, forcing a smile. "I appreciate you taking the time." He nodded curtly and motioned for me to follow him into the building. "You will want to hear about rooms 201, 204, and 207. They are the ones people always ask about." The inside of Silvercrest was worse than the outside, dimly lit with flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. The wallpaper was peeling, and the air was thick with an odd smell, a mix of mildew and something else, something metallic. It was the kind of place that had been forgotten by time. Carrick led me through the lobby, down a narrow hallway lined with doors. The sound of my footsteps echoed unnaturally in the silence, each step feeling heavier than the last. "We've had tenants come and go over the years," Carrick began as we walked, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Most leave within a few months. Some leave without even packing their things. And then there are those who do not leave at all." "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. Carrick stopped in front of a door marked 201. He turned to me, his face still expressionless. This was the first one. A man named Jacob Hadley lived here. Moved in around 1998. Quiet guy. Kept to himself. Paid his rent on time every month. Then, one day, he just disappeared. Disappeared? I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Did anyone report him missing?" "They did," Carrick replied. "The police searched his apartment, asked around the neighborhood, but they never found anything. It was as if he would just vanished." He unlocked the door to room 201 and pushed it open. The smell hit me immediately, a musty, stale odor that clung to the air. The apartment was small, barely furnished. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse and covered in dust. It looked as though no one had lived there for years. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. There was something off about the place. It was not just the disrepair, it was the atmosphere. It felt wrong, like the walls were holding something in, some secret that had been festering for years. Carrick stood in the doorway, watching me. After Jacob, there were others. People who moved into this room, stayed for a while, and then, gone. Same story, every time. They would vanish, leaving everything behind. The police stopped coming after the third or fourth disappearance. Said there was not enough evidence. I walked through the apartment, running my hand along the dusty surface of a table. What do you think happened to them? Carrick's expression did not change. I do not know. All I know is that people who stay in this building for too long, they change. They stop being themselves. What do you mean by change? He did not answer right away, but I could see a flicker of something in his eyes, fear. I have seen it happen. People start acting strange, like they are losing parts of themselves. It starts small, they forget things, they stop talking as much. Then, they stop going out altogether. And then one day, they are gone. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, but I pushed the feeling aside. I was not here to be spooked. I was here to find the truth. What about room 204? I asked. Carrick did not respond, but he motioned for me to follow him again. We walked down the hall to the next apartment, the door slightly ajar. The faint light from inside flickered like a dying candle. He pushed the door open with a creak, revealing a room like the first, small, empty, and cold. This one was different, he said. A woman named Sarah Drummond moved in around 2005. She was peculiar. Always talking about hearing things, seeing shadows in the corners of her eyes. She said the apartment was alive, that it was watching her. I took a step into the room, the air colder here than in 201. The walls were covered in scratch marks, deep gouges in the plaster as if someone had clawed at them in a fit of madness. What happened to her? Carrick's face darkened. She started seeing things that were not there, or maybe they were. One night, she called me, screaming about someone, or something, in her apartment. I rushed over, but when I got here, the door was locked from the inside. By the time I broke it down, she was gone. The only thing left was this. He pointed to a large mirror on the wall, cracked down the middle. I stepped closer, peering into the fractured glass. My reflection looked distorted, twisted in the jagged lines of the crack. For a moment, it almost looked like my face was not my own. Carrick must have noticed me staring. She was obsessed with that mirror, he said quietly. Said she saw things in it, things she could not explain. She was convinced it was showing her something. I turned away from the mirror, trying to shake off the eerie feeling it left behind. And she disappeared too? Carrick nodded. Without a trace. I felt a growing sense of unease as we moved to the final apartment, room 207. The door was closed, and this time, Carrick hesitated before unlocking it. His hand trembled slightly as he pushed the key into the lock. This one's recent, he muttered. A man named Ethan Carlisle. He moved in last year. Everything seemed fine at first, but then, the same signs. He stopped answering his phone, stopped leaving the apartment. The last time I saw him, he looked hollow. Hollow? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Carrick opened the door to 207, and I stepped inside. The room was darker than the others, the light from the hallway barely penetrating the gloom. There was an oppressive heaviness to the air, like the walls were closing in. The apartment was a mess, clothes and belongings scattered everywhere, furniture overturned. On the floor, I noticed something strange, a series of symbols scratched into the wood, like some kind of ritual had taken place. What is this? I asked, crouching down to get a closer look. Carrick did not answer right away. He stood in the doorway, his face pale. Ethan, he was trying to stop it. He thought he could fight whatever was happening to him. What was happening to him? I demanded, my heart pounding in my chest. Carrick's voice was barely audible. He said the building was alive. That it was feeding off the people who lived here. Taking pieces of them, bit by bit. He thought he could stop it by drawing those symbols, but... I stood up, the weight of his words sinking in. But he disappeared too. Carrick nodded. Just like the others. For a moment, the only sound was the creaking of the old building settling around us. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. I could not shake the feeling that something was watching me, something unseen, lurking in the shadows. This building, I said, my voice unsteady. What is it? Carrick's eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in them. I don't know, he whispered. But whatever it is, it has been here for a long time. Longer than any of us. It is hungry. And it is getting stronger. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. The stories, the disappearances, the strange symbols, it all sounded insane, like something out of a horror novel. But standing there in that dark, decaying apartment, I could not deny the feeling in my gut. Something was wrong with this place. Something beyond explanation. I should go, I said, suddenly eager to get out of there. Carrick did not try to stop me. He simply nodded, stepping aside to let me pass. As I walked down the hallway, the weight of the building followed me, each step heavier than the last. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air growing thicker with every breath. When I finally reached the exit, I turned back to look at Carrick one last time. He was standing in the doorway, watching me with that same expressionless face, his eyes dull and lifeless. If you're smart, he said, his voice barely audible over the wind, you will leave this place alone. Some stories are not meant to be told. I did not respond. I just turned and walked away, my heart racing in my chest. But as I left Silvercrest Apartments behind, I could not shake the feeling that something was still with me, that the building had left its mark on me in some way. I had come here searching for answers, but all I found were more questions. Questions I was not sure I wanted the answers to. 3 days had passed, and I could not stop thinking about the apartments. The stories, the symbols, the strange feeling of being watched, it all lingered in my mind like a dark cloud. I tried to push it aside, tried to focus on other stories, but Silvercrest haunted me. I found myself going over my notes repeatedly, trying to piece together the mystery. There had to be something I missed, some clue that would explain everything. But the more I delved into it, the more obsessed I became. And then, late one night, I received a message. It was from an unknown number, but the text was clear, come back to 207. My blood ran cold. I had not told anyone about the apartment, about the things I had seen. So how did someone know? Against my better judgment, I grabbed my coat and keys. I knew I should not go back, knew that whatever was waiting for me at Silvercrest was not something I wanted to face. But I could not stay away. As I drove through the empty streets, the buildings around me seemed to blur, the city fading into the background. The only thing that mattered now was finding out the truth. When I arrived at Silvercrest, the air was thick with the same oppressive silence I remembered. The lights in the lobby flickered as I stepped inside, the familiar smell of mildew and rot filling my nostrils. I made my way to room 207, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was open, just like last time. But this time, I knew something was waiting for me inside. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the darkness. The room was darker than I remembered. It seemed impossible. The light from the hallway should have illuminated the space, but it stopped dead at the doorway as if something in the room swallowed it whole. I stood there, frozen in place, my eyes straining to make out shapes in the gloom. Everything in me screamed to leave, but I could not. The pull of whatever had drawn me back was too strong. I had to know. The door to room 207 creaked shut behind me, though I had not touched it. The sound echoed in the silence, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. My breath was shallow, barely audible as I fumbled for my phone, switching on the flashlight. The beam cut through the thick darkness, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. And then I saw it, the symbols. They were the same ones Carrick had pointed out on my last visit, scratched deeply into the wooden floorboards in front of me, but now there were more. The markings had spread, covering every inch of the floor in erratic patterns. They were not just scratching anymore, they seemed to pulse faintly, glowing with a sickly, faint light that twisted and flickered in my vision. Something was wrong with this place. Something far worse than I had ever imagined. I crouched down, running my fingers along the edges of the symbols, feeling the deep grooves. They were cold, unnaturally so, as if they had been etched with some ancient, malevolent energy. As I touched them, the light from my phone flickered, then dimmed. The temperature in the room dropped abruptly, my breath turning to mist in the air. I jerked back to my feet, scanning the room with the fading light of my phone. A sense of dread washed over me. This was no longer just a place of forgotten tenants and strange disappearances. The building itself was alive, breathing, watching, waiting. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky, breaking the silence. No answer. The darkness seemed to shift, shadows flickering at the corners of my vision. And then I heard it, whispers, soft and indistinct, coming from somewhere deeper in the apartment. I spun around, shining my light toward the source of the sound. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, but I still could not understand them. They were not words, they were more like fragments of thoughts, fractured and disjointed. But the tone was unmistakable, desperate, pleading. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The air felt thicker with each step, as though I were wading through something unseen. The whispers grew louder, and then I realized they were not just coming from one direction. They were coming from everywhere. And then I saw the mirror. It was the same cracked mirror Carrick had shown me during my first visit. The jagged fracture down the center seemed even more pronounced now, as though the glass were barely holding itself together. The whispers seemed to converge here, their frantic tones rising, becoming a cacophony of fear. I approached the mirror, the light from my phone flickering wildly as I did. My reflection in the shattered glass looked distorted, twisted by the cracks. But as I stared, the reflection began to shift, slowly at first, then with growing intensity. It was not me anymore. In the fractured mirror, my face had changed. My features were smeared and stretched, my eyes hollowed out, dark pits where they should have been. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The whispers in the room intensified, becoming unbearable, but they were no longer incoherent. They were chanting something, something that I could not make out, but the rhythm of it sent a wave of cold terror through me. I wanted to run. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to turn around, leave the building, and never come back. But my feet would not move. I was rooted in place, staring at the twisted reflection of myself in that broken mirror. And then the reflection moved. It turned its head toward me, not a reflection of my movement, but a separate, independent action. My heart stopped for a moment as the thing that wore my face smiled, a cruel, empty grin that spread too far across its distorted features. The light from my phone blinked out. Darkness enveloped me, and the whispers stopped. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there in the pitch black, listening to the silence, waiting for something, anything, to happen. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears. But there was nothing. Just silence. Then, slowly, the temperature in the room began to rise. Warmth crept back into the air, but it was not comforting. It felt wrong, thick, and suffocating. My phone buzzed in my hand, its screen flickering back to life, casting a weak light over the room. I glanced at the mirror. It was gone. The mirror, once hanging on the wall, had disappeared completely. In its place, the wall was blank, as if it had never been there. I spun around, shining my light over the room, my mind racing. What was happening? The symbols on the floor were glowing brighter now, casting an eerie green light over everything. They seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, growing more intense with every second. The whispers had stopped, but the air felt thick with an unseen presence, something watching me, waiting for me to act. I turned toward the door, ready to leave, when I heard a sound behind me, a soft, wet sound, like something sliding across the floor. I froze. Slowly, I turned my head, my light catching movement in the corner of the room. Something was crawling toward me from the shadows. At first, I could not make out what it was, just a dark, shifting mass, dragging itself across the floor. But as it moved into the light, I saw it. A figure, its body twisted and broken, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale and slick, as though it had been submerged in water for far too long. And its face, oh God, its face, was blank. No eyes. No mouth. Just smooth, featureless skin stretched over a skull. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. The thing continued to crawl toward me, its movements slow and deliberate, the sound of its dragging limbs filling the room. It was one of them. One of the things Carrick had warned me about, the hollowed-out remains of the tenants who had disappeared from this cursed building. They had not left. They had been consumed, absorbed into whatever darkness lived here. And now it was coming for me. I turned and ran. I did not care where I was going, I just needed to get out. My feet pounded against the floor as I raced down the hallway, the air growing colder with every step. The walls seemed to close in around me, the darkness pressing against my skin like a living thing. Behind me, I could hear the wet, dragging sound growing closer. I reached the door to the stairwell and threw it open, nearly tripping as I scrambled down the steps. My mind was a blur of panic and fear, my only thought to get as far away from that room as possible. The stairwell felt like a maze, twisting and turning in ways that did not make sense. I should have reached the lobby by now, but the stairs seemed to go on forever, the shadows deepening with every turn. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and I could feel the presence of something, many somethings, lurking just out of sight. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I burst through the door and into the lobby. Carrick was there, standing by the entrance, his face as expressionless as ever. But there was something in his eyes, something dark and knowing. "You shouldn't have come back," he said quietly, his voice devoid of any sympathy. I staggered toward him, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "What the hell is this place?" I demanded, my voice trembling with fear and anger. "What's happening to me?" Carrick did not answer. He simply shook his head, a faint, almost pitying smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You came looking for a story," he said softly. "And now you're part of it." I backed away, my mind reeling. What does that mean?" Carrick's smile widened, but it was hollow, empty. "Once you have seen what this place really is, there is no leaving. The building, it has a way of taking what it wants." My heart pounded in my chest. "I'm getting out of here." Carrick shook his head again, his smile fading. "No one ever leaves, not really. You will find that out soon enough." Without another word, I turned and ran for the exit, my hand fumbling for the door handle. The cold metal bit into my skin as I wrenched it open and stumbled out into the night. The air outside was thick with fog, the city lights barely visible through the haze. I glanced back at Silvercrest Apartments, its looming structure shrouded in shadow. For a moment, I thought I saw something, figures moving behind the windows, watching me with hollow eyes. I did not wait to find out. I ran. But even as I fled, as the building disappeared behind me, I could not shake the feeling that it was still with me, that it had left its mark on me. The whispers lingered in my mind, and every shadow seemed to hold something waiting, something hungry. I had come looking for a story, and I found one. But now, I could not escape it. I could never escape Silvercrest.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.